Night black on the Missouri River. A small flame leaps from a loose oil lamp. Thick choking smoke floods the corridor. A door burning hot. Heavy pounding.
Thomas, hold
Screams
on!
echo from
I'm
behind. A
coming!
hand is dragged
No,
away.
let go!
400 miles farther west, on a snow-capped mountain peak, the evening light slides from gold to deep blue. A man stands before two lodgepole pines. In his hand, an official paper. Cold, formal words. He begins dismantling the new room. The blue curtain still hangs. Debts pile up. The deadline is only days away. He rides down to the fort, sits at the table, takes the pen. The nib touches the paper. Snow does not fall in the mountains. It arrives. It comes down through the pines like something quincy, and Ezekiel Marsh had lived under it long enough to stop asking who sent it, or why, or what it thought it was owed. Cedar Hollow was not a town. It was a trading post, and 3 log buildings and a corral, sitting where the trail out of the high country flattened into something a wagon could survive. Zeke ran it alone, had run it alone for 5 winters. Traded pelts and powder and flour to trappers who came down thin and half-frozen, and sold the pelts on to buyers out of St. Louis who never once asked what the mountain cost the men who brought them down. He was 38 years old, built like something the mountain had shaped on purpose, wide through the shoulders, a beard gone half gray at the jaw. Though his hair hadn't caught up yet, hands scarred in the particular way a man's hands scar when he has spent 20 years working with rope and blade and cold iron and never once complained about any of the 3. Quiet in the way that men get quiet when there is no one left to talk to, and talking has stopped being a habit and started being an effort. He split wood before the light was fully up, because that was the hour the cold was worst, and a man who split wood in the worst cold never had to feel it any other time of day. He fed the horses. He checked the traps along the creek line, out of habit more than need now, since the fur company paid less every season, and the walk was long, and his knees had opinions about it these days that they hadn't had 10 years back. The company man who came through each spring liked to say the beaver trade was drying up same as the streams themselves would, someday, and Zeke had stopped arguing the point, because arguing with a fact never once changed it. There was another trapper, older, a wiry man named Amos Teller, who worked the north drainage and stopped at Cedar Hollow twice a month to trade and to talk, mostly to talk, because Amos was the kind of man who'd go half mad without someone to unload his thoughts onto, and Zeke had learned to let him unload without needing to add much back. "You're getting worse," Amos told him once that winter, watching Zeke count out flour sacks without once looking up. "Man your age ought to have somebody to complain to about the cold. Instead, you just take it, like it's owed you." "Somebody has to," Zeke said. "Don't mean it's gotta be you every single year." Zeke hadn't answered that. There wasn't an answer that didn't require saying more than he was built, most days, to say out loud. He'd met Naomi in a church hall in Independence, of all unlikely places for a mountain man to find a wife, back when he still came, down, out of the high country every autumn, to sell his season's furs before the trade route shifted west and made the trip pointless. She'd been pouring coffee at a social her father had put on for the congregation, and she'd looked at Zeke Marsh road-worn, half-wild, more comfortable with a rifle than a teacup, the way a person looks at a puzzle they've decided, on the spot, and for no reason they'd fully explained to solve. "You look like a man who hasn't sat still in a year," she'd told him, handing him the cup. "Longer," he'd said. Well, she'd smiled at that, an easy, unhurried thing. "Sit still a minute, then. See if it kills you." It hadn't killed him. It had, in the plainest sense he knew how to put it, changed the whole shape of his life. Within a year, he'd asked her father. Within 2, they were married, and within 3, she was standing on the ridge behind Cedar Hollow, with her city's soft hands going rough, and her laugh carrying clean across a valley that had never once, before her, had a reason to echo it back. He didn't think of that church hall often. It belonged to a version of himself that felt, most days, like it had happened to some other, younger Zeke Marsh, a man who hadn't yet learned what a mountain could take from a person, and take and keep on taking, and never once apologize for the weight of the bill. But some mornings, splitting wood before the light was fully up, the memory came anyway. Uninvited, the smell of coffee in a warm hall, a woman's voice telling him to sit still and see if it killed him. It hadn't. Not that time. Every morning, without deciding to, he looked up the ridge behind the post, at the flat shelf of ground under the two lodgepole pines, where a plain wooden cross stood in the snow, leaning a little, the way everything leaned a little after 5 winters of wind coming off the peak. Naomi was up there. He didn't say her name out loud much. Didn't need to. Saying a name out loud is for people who are afraid of forgetting it, and Zeke Marsh had the opposite problem entirely. They'd been married 3 years. 3 years that had gone by the way good years go, which is to say too fast to notice until they were already over. She'd come west with him, from Missouri, a preacher's daughter, with steady hands and a laugh that carried farther than she meant it to, and she had never once complained about the cold or the distance or the silence, and he had loved her for that, the way a man loves the one thing that makes a hard life bearable. The fever took her in February, which was the month the pass closed, which meant there was no getting her down to the fort doctor, not on a horse, not on a sled, not any way he'd tried. And he tried every way there was packed her in furs, and made it 2 miles, down the switchback before the drift stopped the horse dead, turned back, tried again the next morning with snowshoes and a sledge he built himself in the dark, made it a mile farther that time, and turned back again with the wind cutting so hard he couldn't feel his own hands closing on the rope. He'd sat with her 4 days after that, packing snow against her skin when the fever climbed too high, praying, which he wasn't a praying man and didn't pretend to be one after, because the praying hadn't worked, and he wasn't in the habit of doing things that didn't work. On the 5th morning, Charlie was quiet in a different way than she'd been quiet before. He buried her himself. Ground too hard for a proper grave that time of year, so he'd had to build a cairn first and dig under it once the thaw came, which meant for 6 weeks he'd walked past a pile of stones every single day, knowing what was under it, before he could finally put her where she belonged, under the 2 pines, where the ground had softened enough to receive her. That was the part nobody in the valley knew. Not the fever, not the burying, the 6 weeks of stones. Some men break in a way you can see. A slump in the shoulders, a shake in the hand. Zeke Marsh had broken in the way a beam breaks inside a wall. No crack showing on the surface, the house still standing, the roof still holding, and nobody finds out until the day the whole thing comes down at once. He hadn't come down. Not yet. He'd built a life instead. Efficient. Silent. The kind of life a man can run on for years, the way a fire runs on the last log burning fine. Burning clean. Right up until there's nothing left to burn. 5 years is a long time to eat alone. At a table built for 2, it was the winter of '50 that finally told on him. The trapper Coates, who used to stop through twice a season with his family on the way to Fort Laramie, had moved his people east. That fall said the mountain living wasn't worth it with young ones underfoot, and Zeke had understood the logic and hated the quiet that came after it. Because that was the thing about a mountain. It didn't get lonelier all at once. It got lonelier one absence at a time. One less wagon on the trail, one less voice at the counter, until a man was standing in his own trading post at dusk, listening to a stillness so complete he could hear his own heart working and wondering when exactly he'd stopped minding it and started needing it to stop. He sat at the table one evening in early spring '51 now, the snow just beginning to give, and looked at the second chair, the one across from his, the one nobody had sat in for 5 years except the occasional trapper passing through, and that wasn't the same, and both of them knew it. And he thought, I am a man who can survive up here. That was never the question. The question was whether surviving was the whole of what he wanted from the years he had left. He didn't answer it that night. He answered it 3 weeks later, in a letter, because that was how a man like Zeke Marsh did most of his, deciding not in a single moment, but in the slow accumulation of mornings where the second chair stayed empty, and the coffee went cold if he'd poured the second cup out of a habit that had no reason left to exist. He wrote to a marriage broker's office in St. Louis. A Mrs. Hattersley ran it, matched frontier men, with women willing to come west for a fair chance and an honest partner, and Zeke had heard of her through the supply man who swore by her reputation. He wrote the letter 3 times. The first read like a contract: age, property, terms. He tore it up because it sounded like he was buying stock. The second read too soft, apologetic almost, like he was ashamed to be asking. And that wasn't true either. He tore that one up too. The third he wrote plain: I am 38 years old. I run a trading post at the base of Cedar Ridge in the Western Mountains. I was married 3 years to a good woman who died of fever, and I have been alone 5 winters since. I am not a man who needs conversation to fill every hour, but I am tired of the kind of quiet that has stopped feeling like peace. I am looking for a woman who is not afraid of hard country or hard work, or a man who does not always have easy words for what he feels. Age is no concern to me. Prior hardship, in my experience, makes for a steadier partner than an easy life does. He read it once more, decided it was honest, which was the only standard he trusted himself to meet, and he rode 2 days down to the fort to post it, because Cedar Hollow had no regular mail, and the trip was the price of doing this properly. Then he rode home and waited, and told himself the waiting didn't cost him anything. It cost him more than he let on, even to himself, which was, in its way, exactly the kind of quiet he'd been trying to escape. Philadelphia did not have mountains. It had brick and gaslight, and the particular ceaseless motion of a city that never once paused to ask whether the people inside it were keeping up. Prudence Wynne had kept up for 16 years. She'd started at Ashford's dressmaking on Chestnut Street the week she turned 15, hired for her hands before anyone bothered to notice the rest of her, and the hands had proven worth every penny of the wage. By 25, she was senior seamstress. By 31, she was the one Mr. Ashford sent for when a client's gown had to be right, not close, not nearly, right because a wedding was 3 days off, and there was no room left for a second try. She was good. She knew she was good, the way a person knows a fact rather than believes an opinion, because the proof was in every gown that fit a body, the way that body actually was, and not the way a pattern book pretended bodies were shaped. Other seamstresses cut to the pattern and made the woman fit it. Prudence cut to the woman and made the pattern earn its place on the table. Mr. Ashford himself was a decent enough employer, as employers went, fair with wages, fair with credit for good work, the sort of man who noticed talent and rewarded it, without ever quite noticing the person attached to the talent. He'd say, to a client fretting over a hem, let Miss Wynne see to it, she's the best hands I've got, and mean it as the highest compliment he owned, and never once think to wonder how it might land on a woman who'd spent 16 years being praised for her hands specifically, as though the rest of her required a separate accounting. There had been a client once, a Mrs. Fenwick, stout herself, though she'd have fought the word, who'd sat for a fitting and studied Prudence in the mirror a long moment before saying, not unkindly, you've a gift, dear. Shame you can't sew yourself into something smaller. And Prudence had pinned the hem straight and said nothing, because the wage depended on saying nothing, and had gone home that night and stood a long while in front of her own small mirror above the bakery, turning sideways, studying herself the way she studied a client, not for what was wrong, but for what the garment needed to become in order to fit the person standing in it. She'd never once, in 16 years, needed a garment to change who she was. She'd simply needed the world to stop insisting the fault lay with the body and not the pattern. Her mother had taught her the first stitches, at a kitchen table in a rented room, before consumption took her when Prudence was 14, and the one thing Prudence had kept whole out of those years, kept whole, the way a person keeps the single unbroken plate from a set that's lost the rest, was a sentence her mother used to say. So often, it had worn smooth as a river stone. A woman doesn't need everyone's approval. She needs one honest room to stand in. Prudence had spent 16 years looking for that room in Ashford's shop, and finding, instead, a great deal of grudging respect for her hands, and a good deal of quiet, unspoken opinion about the rest of her, which the shop's patrons rarely said aloud and never needed to, because the up-and-down look did the saying for them. She was 31 years old, and she was, by the measure the world around her, insisted on using first and every other measure second, a large woman, broad through the shoulders and the hip, full in a way that no corset in that shop, and she had made most of them, was cut to flatter. She had made peace with it years before anyone else had. That was the part nobody understood. The peace had come first. The world's opinion had simply refused to catch up, which brought her on a Tuesday afternoon in March of that year to the workroom floor of Ashford's, holding a pincushion, watching Charlotte Reyes, a junior girl, sweet, not unkind, just young enough to think loud thoughts belonged in a quiet room, turn from the front window, with her face gone the color of chalk. Prudence. Charlotte's voice had a crack in it. "He's Mr. Halloway," is out front with his mother, because Thomas Halloway had been courting her. 6 months of Sunday walks and one dinner, with his family and a conversation, 3 weeks back, that had used the word understanding in a way that made a woman start quietly planning. He worked in his father's shipping office. He had a gentle laugh and an easy way of asking after her day that she had let herself believe meant something steadier than it did. She set the pincushion down, walked to the front of the shop with her chin level, because a wind did not scurry whatever else a wind did. And there he was, Thomas, hat in his hands, his mother beside him, in a coat the color of old money, and the older woman's eyes went over Prudence once top to bottom, one long unhurried pass before she spoke, not to Prudence but past her to Miss Ashford, who had come to the front at the sound of the bell. "We won't be needing the fitting. After all," Mrs. Halloway said, "my son will not be marrying a woman of this size. It reflects poorly. I'm sure you understand." 6 words did it. A woman of this size. Said the way a person points out a stain. Thomas didn't meet her eyes. That was the part that stayed with her longest, longer, even than the words, not the cruelty of the mother, which she could file away as a stranger's opinion and forget by supper, but the silence of the man, who had walked with her every Sunday for half a year, and could not now find one word to put between his mother's sentence and the door. The shop had gone still. 3 other clients waiting on fittings. Charlotte with a hand pressed over her mouth. The bell over the door still faintly ringing from when it opened. Prudence Wynne did not cry in front of Chestnut Street. She had that much left, whatever else the moment had taken. She said evenly, even was the only register she trusted her voice to hold behind Mrs. Halloway. "I'd hate for you to strain yourself finding it." Then she went back to the workroom and picked the pincushion back up, and her hands did not shake, which surprised her more than anything else that afternoon, because everything else in her was shaking plenty. She didn't go home that night. She walked. Along the Schuylkill, in the cold March dark, the way she'd walked since she was 16, when the noise in her chest got too loud for 4 walls to hold it. And somewhere on that walk she could never afterward say exactly where the humiliation burned down into something colder and more useful. Not less painful, just more useful. 16 years, she thought. 16 years of being the best hands in that shop, and one look from that woman erased every stitch of it in under a minute. Except that wasn't quite right either. Nothing was erased. That was the trick of it. The thing that made the walking necessary. Nothing about her had actually changed in that doorway. Not her hands. Not her 16 years. Not one single stitch of the work that had made her the woman Ashford sent for when a gown absolutely had to be right. So what had happened then? What exactly? A room had looked at her. That was all. A room had looked, and decided, and left. And the terrible part, the part she kept circling back to, no matter how many times she told herself to let it go, was that the room's decision had felt, for one long, humiliating minute, like the only one that counted, which meant the problem was never the work. The work was never in question. The problem was a room full of people who had decided, before she opened her mouth, what she was worth. And she had spent 16 years trying to outwork that verdict, and it had not moved an inch, because a verdict like that isn't waiting on evidence. It's already decided. It's just waiting for an excuse. She thought of her mother's line again, the river smooth one. One honest room to stand in. Prudence didn't have that room. Not in Philadelphia. 16 years. and she still didn't have it. 2 days later, Charlotte left a folded newspaper on the cutting table before the shop opened, said nothing, just tapped the page twice with one finger, and went back to her thread. The ledger, folded to the back pages. A column of small notices under a header that read, Western Correspondence, Reputable Parties Seeking Marriage. Prudence almost didn't read it. Told herself it was foolishness, the kind of thing desperate women answered, and she was not desperate. She had a trade and a wage and a room of her own. Except she read it anyway, because a person can have a trade and a wage and a room of her own, and still lie a life that has more in it than all three combined. Most of the notices were the kind she expected, men listing acreage like a man lists cattle. Words like comely and agreeable, used the way a shop uses a good window display, meant to catch the eye, meant to promise nothing specific enough to be held to later. One notice near the bottom had none of that. 38. Trading Post, Western Mountains. Widower, 3 years married, 5 years alone. Not a man who needs conversation to fill every hour. Looking for a woman not afraid of hard country or hard work, or a man without easy words. Age no concern. Prior hardship makes for a steadier partner. No comely. No promise of anything but honesty and difficulty in equal measure. She read it 4 times. And what struck her, what actually made her set the paper down and pick it back up twice before she trusted the feeling, was that this was the only notice in the entire column that had not spent one word describing what it wanted her to look like. She copied the return address into her own hand before she let herself think better of it. Mrs. Hattersley's office, St. Louis. That night, in the small room she rented above a bakery on Arch Street, she wrote the first letter of her life into one she had never seen. And she wrote it the way she cut fabric, no waste, no filler, every line doing its own honest work. Mr. Marsh, my name is Prudence Wynne. I am 31 years old, unmarried, and have worked as a seamstress in Philadelphia for 16 years. I read your notice because it did not ask me to be anything but capable and unafraid of hard living, and those 2 things I can promise you. I do not know the first thing about mountain winters. I am willing to learn. I would like to know more about the life you are offering. Before either of us decides anything further, she signed it, sealed it, and sat a long moment with her hand flat on the envelope, feeling the strange new weight of having said something true to a stranger 4 weeks' travel away, and having no way yet to know if it would land anywhere at all. Mrs. Hattersley's office sat above a hardware store on a street 2 blocks off the St. Louis levee, and if a person had walked through it that spring, they would have found nothing more remarkable than a small woman at a large desk, sorting envelopes into stacks with the brisk efficiency of a person who had matched several hundred marriages and buried none of the illusions that might have made the work romantic. She read every letter that passed through her hands, both directions, not to censor them. She wasn't in the habit of editing another person's heart, but because a broker who didn't know her correspondent's honesty from their performance was a broker who'd get somebody killed out west by a bad match, and Hattersley had built her whole reputation on not doing that. Zeke Marsh's notice had crossed at her desk in February, plain as a plank of pine, and she'd filed it under the small stack she privately thought of as the honest ones, the men who didn't dress their loneliness up in acreage and adjectives. Prudence Wynne's answer crossed her desk in March, and Hattersley read it twice before forwarding it on, because something in the second paragraph, I do not know the first thing about mountain winters, I am willing to learn, struck her as exactly the sentence an honest woman writes and a performing one never bothers to. She didn't tell either of them what she thought. That wasn't her job. Her job was the forwarding, the discretion, the occasional word of caution when a match looked wrong on paper before it ever got the chance to go wrong in person. She'd seen enough matches go wrong to know the shape of it before it happened. A man who wrote 3 pages about his land and 1 sentence about himself. A woman who answered every letter within the hour, too eager, the eagerness itself a kind of warning. Hattersley had learned to read the way a sailor reads weather. The ones that worked, and a fair number did, more than the gossips back east liked to credit, were almost always the plain ones. the ones where two strangers simply told each other the truth in small doses and let the truth do the work that flattery never could. This one, she thought, sealing the envelope for the westward post, didn't look wrong on paper. It looked like the rare kind that might actually hold. She had no way of knowing sealing it, what the spring would do to test that guess. The letter reached Cedar Hollow in the last week of March, carried up from the fort by a supply rider who complained the whole way about the mud. Zeke read it standing at the counter. Read it once fast, the way a man reads bad news, out of some old instinct that this too might be bad news dressed as good. Then once slow, because it wasn't bad news. It was the opposite, and slow reading was the only way to trust a thing that good. I am 31 years old, unmarried, and have worked as a seamstress in Philadelphia for 16 years. No flourishes. No effort to charm him. Just a woman stating what she was, the way he'd stated what he was, and something in Zeke's chest, loosened, half an inch that had been pulled tight for longer than he'd realized. He wrote back the same evening, told her about Cedar Hollow, the trading post, the trapping trade, the fort two days south for supplies and mail. Told her the winters ran long and hard, that the pass closed some years by November and didn't open again till April, that a person up here had to be the kind who could sit with her own company for months at a stretch without souring on her. He did not tell her about Naomi. Not yet. That felt like a thing a person earned the right to hear, not a thing you handed a stranger in a first letter, however honest the rest of it was. Her second letter came a few weeks later, which told him she'd written back the same afternoon she'd read his. The mail simply took what it took over that kind of distance, and there was no hurrying it from either end. She asked good questions, not the polite, empty kind, real ones. What does a person do here for 6 months of snow besides survive it? Is there a doctor or a woman who knows medicine, in case one is needed? What did your first wife's life look like? Here I ask not to pry, but because I think it will tell me more than anything you could say about yourself directly. He answered the practical parts first, because those were easier to hold steady while writing. There was no doctor at Cedar Hollow. The nearest was 2 days south at the fort. Less if the trail was clear, more than a week if the pass had closed, and a person had to go the long way round through the lower valley. There was a woman at the fort, a sergeant's wife, who knew enough of medicine to set a bone or bring down a fever, and most winters that had to be enough, because most winters it was all there was. He told her, plain as he told everything, that a person came to this country, understanding the nearest help might be a day away, or two, or unreachable entirely until the snow gave, and that this was not a thing he could soften for her without lying about the life he was offering. He sat with the last question about Naomi a long while before he answered it. Naomi came west with me from Missouri. We were married 3 years. She died of a fever in the winter, the pass closed, and there was no getting her down to help in time. I buried her on the ridge above the post. I think about her every day, and I expect I always will, and if that is a difficulty for you to hear, I would rather know it now than later. He sent it before he could talk himself into softening it. Her answer, when it came, held the sentence that he would carry with him the rest of his life, though he didn't know that yet, reading it that first time at the counter with the lamp burning low. It is not a difficulty. A man who still grieves a good wife after 5 years is a man who knows how to love carefully. I would rather have that than a man who forgets easily. Grief is not a warning to me, Mr. Marsh. It's a reference. He read that line 9 times. He counted later, embarrassed at himself for counting, and did it anyway. The third letter was Prudence's, and it contained the sentence she had rewritten more times than any other line she'd ever put to paper, because she had learned the hard way on a Tuesday in March, in front of a shop full of witnesses, exactly what happened when a man discovered a fact about her body from someone else's mouth instead of her own. She was not going to let that happen twice. Mr. Marsh, there is something I should tell you plainly, because I would rather you know it from me than be surprised by it. When I step off a train, I am a large woman. Not delicate, not what a fashion plate calls handsome. I am broad and I am strong, and I have been told, more than once, and not kindly, that this makes me less than other women. I do not believe that, and I will not spend the rest of my life apologizing for a body that has never once failed to do a full day's work. If that is a difficulty for you, I would rather know it now than later. You said the same to me about your grief. I am only returning the courtesy." She sealed the letter and did not sleep that night. Lay awake in the dark above the bakery, listening to the ovens start their pre-dawn heat 2 floors down, and turned the sentinels over and over, waiting to feel regret. The regret didn't come. What came instead was something steadier, because for the first time in longer than she could easily name, she had told a man the truth about herself, before he had the chance to find fault with it first. And whatever answer came back, at least it would be an answer to her, not to some idea of her a room had already decided on without asking. The letter took 11 days to reach Cedar Hollow. Zeke read it standing in the same spot at the counter, the way he always did, as though the counter itself had become the place where his life's largest news arrived. He read the paragraph about her body twice, and what moved through him was not what she had braced herself for, not disappointment, not hesitation, not the polite retreat she'd half expected, even from a man who'd written so plainly himself. What moved through him was something closer to recognition, because he thought, standing there, of the mountain itself, of how a man who'd spent 5 years up here had learned that softness wasn't strength and thinness wasn't virtue, that what mattered on Cedar Ridge, what actually kept a person alive through a hard winter, was a body and a will that could work a full day and not quit. He thought of Naomi's hands, thin and fine and city-soft, when she'd first arrived, and how the mountain had built calluses onto them within a year, and how he'd loved her more for the calluses than he ever had for the softness underneath them. He sat a long while before he picked up the pen, because a man only gets one first answer to a letter like that, and there wasn't any taking it back once it was sent. What if I say it wrong, he thought. What if I mean it right, and it comes out wrong on the page, and she reads it the way half of Philadelphia must have read her plain as an insult, dressed up as kindness? No. Start over. What if I say too little, and she thinks I'm only being polite? Men are polite about all manner of things they don't actually believe. Start over again. He set the pen down, picked it back up, thought of Naomi's hands, thin and city-soft that first year, and the calluses the mountain had built onto them by the second. And somewhere in that thought, the doubt finally quieted enough to let him write. He wrote back that same night, and this was the letter he would remember longest, because it was the one where he stopped writing carefully and started writing true. Miss Wynne, I do not need a woman built like a fashion plate. I need a woman who can stand up to a mountain and not fold. From what you've written me the 16 years, the plain talk, the way you told me a hard truth, without softening it to spare yourself embarrassment, I expect you could stand up to a good deal, more than a mountain. Your size is not a difficulty to me. If anything, it tells me you've already survived the kind of judgment that would flatten a weaker person and come through it plain-spoken and unashamed. That's the kind of steady I've been looking for. She read that letter on the workroom floor, between fittings, and had to set it down twice before she could finish it, because her hands weren't entirely steady, and a seamstress with unsteady hands does no one any good. Charlotte, passing with a bolt of muslin, caught her wiping her eyes and didn't ask. Just set the muslin down, touched Prudence's shoulder once, and went back to her cutting table. Some kindnesses don't need words. Charlotte had learned that from watching Prudence for 2 years. Now she was returning it. By the 4th letter, they had both stopped writing, like strangers being careful, and started writing like two people who had found, against considerable odds, someone worth being careless with. Zeke told her about the ridge behind the trading post, the 2 lodgepole pines, the way the light came sideways across the whole valley in late afternoon, gold, then rust, then a blue that wasn't quite dark yet, and how a person could stand up there and see clear to the next range of peaks and feel, for one held breath, like the whole hard world was worth the trouble of living in it. He did not tell her that Naomi was buried under those pines. He would tell her that in person. Some things needed a face to be told properly, not a page. Prudence wrote back that she had a walk of her own along the Schuylkill most evenings since she was 16, and that she would not miss Philadelphia when she left it. Not the noise, not the brick, not the particular way a city could make a person feel crowded and unseen in the very same hour. But she would miss that walk. Not out of complaint, she wrote, but because she wanted him to understand that she noticed what she was leaving, which meant she would notice, with the same attention, what she was arriving into. He read that paragraph 3 times before he answered it, and thought about it for 2 full days before he trusted himself to write back. And what he finally sent her was this: the view from the ridge at 5 in the evening, in October, with the light coming the way I told you. That is the thing I believe you will find worth the trade. I don't say things like that easily. I'm saying it now because I think you're the kind of woman who'd want to know it before you decided, not after. He did not usually write sentences with that much feeling in them. He sent it before he could talk himself out of it, the same way he'd once, years back, jumped into a spring-melt creek to pull a drowning calf out before his mind had finished deciding whether the water was too cold to survive. Some decisions a person makes with the whole body and lets the mind catch up after. The 5th letter was the one where they stopped discussing whether and started discussing when. She asked, plainly, what she should bring west, that she would not find waiting for her at Cedar Hollow. He answered, just as plainly, good wool, sturdy boots, whatever tools of her own trade she couldn't bear to leave behind, because a woman who could sew could earn her own standing in a place, liked faster than almost any other skill he could think of. She wrote back that she was bringing her shears, her good needles, and a bolt of Boston wool she'd been saving 3 years for a reason she hadn't known until now. The shears had been her mother's. Steel gone dark with age but still true, still sharp enough to cut a straight line through the heaviest wool, without a single wasted stroke. And Prudence had kept them oiled and honed for 17 years the way another woman might keep a locket not for use, most days, but for the plain fact of having something of her mother's still warm from a living hand. She wrapped them in flannel before she packed them, the night before her trunk was to be lashed shut, and sat a moment on the edge of her bed with the bundle in her lap, thinking of a kitchen table in a rented room, and a woman with steady hands teaching a girl of 6 how to hold a needle without stabbing her own thumb, and a sentence worn smooth as a river stone. One honest room to stand in. Well, Mama, she thought, I couldn't find it here. I'm going to go build one myself, 400 miles west, out of cedar and cold air and a man's plain handwriting. I hope that's not too strange a way to have finally listened to you. She hadn't let herself put it in those terms before, even privately. But sitting there with her mother's shears, wrapped in flannel on her lap, the truth of it settled plain. She wasn't simply leaving Philadelphia. She was choosing Cedar Hollow, deliberately, the way a person chooses a life and not merely escapes an old one. She told him, in the letter that followed, where the shears had come from. He read it standing at the counter, the way he read everything of hers now, and understood that she wasn't only carrying good wool and sturdy boots west. She was carrying her whole history with her, folded small enough to fit in a trunk, and trusting a stranger on a mountain to be worth the weight of it. The 6th letter carried the fare. Train to St. Louis, then steamboat up the Missouri to the last river town before the overland stage. Then the stage itself, 3 days, to the fort, where Zeke would meet her and bring her the final stretch up to Cedar Hollow by wagon. Prudence read the arrangements twice, the way she read every important document, checking for what might be missing, rather than what was there. Then she wrote her answer, the shortest letter of the 6, because by then there was very little left that needed explaining and a great deal that simply needed confirming. I will be on the boat that arrives the last week of April. I have given notice at Ashford's. Charlotte cried, which surprised me more than my own leaving did. I am not a woman given to excitement. I can't account for Mr. Marsh, but I will tell you plainly, I am accounting for quite a lot of it right now, and I don't intend to apologize for that either. She signed it Prudence Wynne, the way she always signed everything, with no flourish beneath it. He had come to understand, over 6 letters, that the plainness of her signature was its own kind of promise. A commitment stated once and trusted to stand on its own, without decoration propping it up. He put the letter with the other 5 in the tin box he kept under the counter, and did the arithmetic on his fingers more than once that week, the way a man does when a date has stopped being an abstraction on paper and started being a fixed point his whole life is now arranged around. The last week of April, he started on the back room the following morning. It had been a storeroom since Naomi dyed sacks of flour and coiled rope and the overflow of a trading post that had long since stopped needing a second bedroom for anything but goods, and he cleared it out over 3 days, hauling the flour sacks to the main storeroom, coiling the rope onto pegs in the barn, sweeping 5 years of dust out the door in drifts that caught the wind and scattered before they'd gone 10 feet. He built a bed frame from cedar, planed smooth, because a woman who'd spent 16 years bent over other people's fine work deserved, he figured, to sleep somewhere that didn't creak and complain every time she turned over. He fitted a window where there hadn't been one, cutting the log wall himself over 2 cold mornings so that whoever slept in that room would wake to the same eastern light that woke him, instead of the flour sack dark the room had known for 5 years. Amos came through midweek and stood in the doorway a long moment, taking in the fresh-cut window, the planed bed frame. The room swept cleaner than any room at Cedar Hollow had been swept since Naomi's time. Man builds a room like that, Amos said, for a woman he hasn't even met yet. Man builds a room like that, Zeke said, not looking up from the frame he was sanding smooth, for a woman he's known 6 letters worth, which some days feels like more than most men know their wives after 6 years. Amos had no answer for that. Just nodded, the way a man nods at a thing he recognizes, but has never once felt himself, and left Zeke to his sanding. He hung a curtain, the only new cloth in the place, bought off a peddler passing through, with dry goods, plain blue, because he had no way of knowing her taste yet, and plain blue seemed a safe enough guess for a woman who valued honesty over decoration. He set a chair by the window, small things. Things that didn't cost him much in coin, but cost him a great deal more in the particular vulnerability of hoping openly, physically, in cedar and glass and plain blue cloth, for a life he had spent feeling himself he'd already had and lost. He stood in the doorway of the finished room the evening, before he rode down to the fort, and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in a long while, which was simple, uncomplicated anticipation, the kind a man feels the night before something good, rather than the night before something merely bearable. Except it wasn't entirely uncomplicated. Standing there, hand on the doorframe, a thought came at him sideways the way those thoughts always did, uninvited and unwelcome and impossible to fully turn away. Is this a betrayal, he wondered, building a bed for another woman in a house Naomi had once called her whole world? No. He caught himself on it fast, the way a man catches himself before a fall. Naomi wasn't a woman who'd have wanted this house standing empty as some kind of monument. She'd have called that a waste, and she'd have been right to call it that, because Naomi Marsh had never once in 3 years of marriage mistaken sentiment for love. She'd have wanted the fire kept lit. She'd have wanted the second chair filled. He believed that. Most days he believed it entirely. Some nights, standing in a doorway, with a plain blue curtain hanging in the last of the light, he only half believed it and made himself walk forward anyway, because a man who waited for full certainty before every hard, hopeful thing he did would still be standing in that same doorway when the mountain finally took him too. He rode down to the fort himself that week, on an excuse about supplies that fooled nobody, least of all himself, and asked the quartermaster there, a broad, unhurried man named Corliss, whether the mail rider might bring word early if the boat made good time. Corliss had looked at him with the particular patience of a man who had watched a great many other men fall for a great many other women over a great many years at that fort, and said only, "Rider comes through regular, Marsh. Word'll come when it comes." Zeke rode back up the mountain that evening, with the light doing exactly the thing he'd promised her it would do: gold, then rust, then that held breath blue. And for the first time in 5 years, he stood on the ridge by Naomi's cross and spoke to her out loud, not in grief, in something closer to permission asked for, and he believed quietly given. "I think you'd have liked her," he said. The wind took the words the way it took everything. Up there, out over the valley and gone. "I think you'd have told me to stop wasting good years being careful." He didn't wait for an answer. He'd learned, 5 winters back, that the mountain didn't give those. It only ever gave weather and time and the occasional mercy of a clear evening to stand in. Prudence's last week in Philadelphia went by the way important weeks always seem to too slow in the daylight, too fast the moment she looked back on it. She sold what furniture she owned to the family below the bakery, packed her shears and her needles and the 3-year bolt of Boston wool into a trunk that Charlotte helped her lash shut on the final morning, both of them kneeling on the lid to get the buckle to catch. "You're really going," Charlotte said, somewhere between a question and an accusation. "I'm really going. To a mountain. To a mountain. You've never even seen a mountain, Prudence." "No." The buckle caught. Prudence sat back on her heels. "I've seen Chestnut Street for 16 years. I know exactly what that gets a woman." Charlotte was quiet a moment, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve, the way she did when she had a thing to say and hadn't yet decided whether saying it was her place. Men lie in those notices. Everyone knows it. He didn't lie. You don't know that. You've never met him. I've read 6 letters from him, Charlotte. 6. That's more honest words than Thomas Halloway managed in 6 months of Sundays. Prudence stood, brushed off her skirt. "A man who lies writes pretty. Mr. Marsh doesn't write pretty. He writes true. There's a difference, and I've spent 16 years with a needle learning to spot it." "You'll write," Charlotte said. "Not a question, this time." "I will. And if he's not what the letters said, then I'll have my shears and my own 2 hands, same as I've had for 16 years. Prudence reached for her coat. "I'm not walking west blind, Charlotte. I'm walking west with my eyes open wider than they've ever been." Mr. Ashford himself had come round the shop, the day she gave her notice hat already off, the way he only ever took it off for clients with money or trouble, and Prudence hadn't been sure at first which category she'd become. 16 years, he said, as if the number itself were an argument. 16 years. She agreed. "You're my best hands, Miss Wynne. You know that." "I do. A mountain trading post." He said it the way a man says a word in a language he doesn't quite trust himself to pronounce. "That's a hard thing to trade 16 years of steady wage for." "It's a harder thing," Prudence said, "to spend another 16 being the best hands in a room that's already decided what the rest of me is worth." She folded her apron, set it on the counter, the last of a great many aprons she'd folded in that shop. "I'll not forget what you taught me, Mr. Ashford. But I'm done being grateful for a wage that never once came with respect attached." He hadn't argued that. Had simply nodded, slow the way a man nods at a truth he'd rather not have heard spoken plain, and wished her well and meant it in the limited way he meant most things. Charlotte hugged her at the depot, quick and fierce, and did in fact cry, which she'd warned her she might. And Prudence held herself steady, the way she'd held herself steady in front of the Halloways, because some habits a person builds for one purpose and finds they serve for several others besides. The train to St. Louis took 4 days. She spent most of it at the window, watching brick give way to farmland, farmland give way to something wilder and less fenced, and felt something in her chest loosen with every mile, the way a seam gives when a garment has finally been cut to fit the body wearing it instead of the other way around. St. Louis, when she reached it, was a river town, in every sense of the word noise and mud, and the smell of wood smoke and fish, boats stacked 3 deep along the levee, agents shouting fares. A whole economy built on the business of moving people west, and never once looking back to see how they'd fared once they'd gone. The steamer was called the Missouri Rose, wide in the beam, twin stacks, paddle wheel, churning, brown, water white at the stern, and Prudence stood on the levee a long moment before boarding, trunk at her feet, and thought plainly, the way she thought most things, that this boat was the last solid ground between the woman she had been for 31 years and the woman she was about to become. A young woman jostled her elbow at the gangplank, apologized quick and bright, and introduced herself in the same breath, Patience. Patience Wynne. If you'll believe the coincidence, ma'am, I don't suppose we're kin, and laughed at her own name, the way a person laughs who has told the same joke about it 100 times, and never once tired of the reaction. Prudence, Prudence said, and watched the girl's eyebrows climb. No, I'm afraid so. Two wins. Well, on one boat, it would appear so. Well, Patience pressed a hand to her chest, delighted. Now that's a thing to tell my mother. Two wins on one boat and neither one owing the other a cent. Patience was younger, 20 maybe, 20, traveling to join a brother who'd staked a claim somewhere past the fort. And she talked the way young women talk when the whole of their life still feels like it's arranging itself in their favor easily, quickly, without the caution 31 years teaches a person to build in. You're going to be married, Patience said. Over supper that first night. Not quite a question, the way young people ask things they've already decided the answer to. I am. Do you love him? I've never met. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I've got. Prudence set down her fork. I know his handwriting better than I know most men's faces. I know he built a room with his own two hands, rather than write a fancy letter he didn't mean. I know he told me the truth about his grief before I ever asked for it. Whether that's love yet, I couldn't tell you. I expect I'll know it when I see it, same as everybody does. That's the most sensible thing I've ever heard anybody say about getting married. 16 years of sewing other women's wedding gowns will do that to a person's expectations. Patience laughed at that, bright and easy, and Prudence found herself smiling in return. The first easy smile she'd managed since the Halloways had walked out of Ashford's front door. They were given berths one deck apart, and the purser, checking names against his list that first evening, made a small joke of it to 2p. Wins aboard, ladies. Mind we don't confuse your correspondence, and nobody on that boat, least of all Prudence, thought anything more of it than a pleasant coincidence to mention in a letter home. The days on the river settled into their own rhythm. Brown water sliding past low green banks. The paddle wheel's steady churn, loud enough at first to keep her from sleep, then familiar enough, within 2 days, that its absence, on the one evening the boat tied up for repairs, felt stranger than the noise ever had. She spent the mornings at the rail with Patience, the afternoons with her needle, mending a hem for a fellow passenger in exchange for a second helping at supper, was 'cause idle hands had never once suited her, and a boat full of strangers was as good a place as any to prove it. She thought, more than once, of the letter she owed him, a note from St. Louis, confirming the boat. A longer one she meant to write once she'd reached the fort and could tell him plainly, in her own hand, exactly which day to expect her. She hadn't sent it yet. There would be time enough at the next stop, she told herself. There was always, she believed, more time than a person thought. The Missouri Rose pulled away from the levee at first light. 2 mornings later, paddle wheel churning, whistle sounding once, long and low, over the brown water, and the whole city receding behind it into a haze of wood smoke and distance. Prudence stood at the rail until St. Louis was nothing but a smudge on the horizon, one hand resting on the rail, the other pressed flat against her coat where a small bundle of 6 letters rode in an inner pocket, close against her heart, the way a person carries the one thing they cannot afford to lose track of. She did not know, standing there, that 400 miles ahead of her, a man was climbing a ridge each evening to speak to a grave, counting days on his fingers, building an entire second chance out of the plain conviction that she was, at that very hour, coming toward him. She only knew the river was wide, and the current was strong, and the boat beneath her feet was carrying her west with a steadiness that felt, for the first time in longer than she could easily name, like the whole hard world might actually be worth the trouble of living in it. The rider came up from the fort on a Tuesday morning, 4 days later than Zeke had let himself expect anything, which was its own particular torment. The waiting stretched thin, then thinner, until a man started inventing reasons. The delay meant nothing. Zeke was at the counter, sorting traps, when he heard the horse. He looked up, recognized the rider young man. Pruitt was his name. Rode the Cedar Hollow route twice a month regular, and felt the first easy lift of relief, because a letter this early in the week could only be one thing. Except Pruitt didn't dismount easy the way he usually did. He came down off the horse slow, careful, the way a man moves when he is carrying something heavier than the saddlebag accounts for. Marsh. He held out a single folded paper. Didn't meet Zeke's eyes doing it. This came through the fort yesterday. Corliss said to bring it up special. Didn't want it waiting on the regular route. Which was wrong. Which was already wrong before a single word of it was read, because nothing about a mail route that ran fine on its own schedule needed a rider sent up special, unless the thing inside the envelope couldn't wait. Zeke took it. His hands the same hands that had built this counter, framed this whole post, driven every post in the corral fence without a single winter off, were not steady taking it. He noticed that the way a man notices something happening to someone else, a small clinical corner of his mind stepping back to observe the rest of him falling apart. In real time, he unfolded it. It was written in an unfamiliar hand, official, from the steamboat company's agent at the last river town, addressed to Mrs. Hattersley's office in St. Louis, and forwarded on, because that address was the only one anyone traveling with the agency carried on their person. It is, with deep regret, we inform you of the loss of a passenger aboard the steamer Missouri Rose, which suffered a fire in its forward cabin on the night of the 6th. Among those confirmed lost was a Miss P. Wynn, traveling as a bride under contract to your agency, destination Western Territories. We extend our sincerest sympathies to all concerned. He read it once, then again, slower. The way a man rereads something hoping the second pass will find a different set of words hiding under the first. And it never does, and some deep foolish part of every human being tries that trick anyway, every single time. A Miss P. Wynn, confirmed lost. The counter was under his hands. He knew that only because his knuckles had gone white against the wood, and even that registered from somewhere far off, like weather happening to another man's house. Pruitt was saying something, words with the shape of sympathy in them. Awful sorry, Marsh. Real sorry to be the one. But they arrived the way sound arrives underwater present, technically, and utterly without meaning. Because how does a man's mind hold two facts at once when they cannot both be true, and yet both, somehow, are sitting right there on the same page? She had written 6 letters. She had told him a hard truth about her own body without flinching, because she trusted him to hear it plain. She had signed her name with no flourish, because the plainness was the promise. And now, a stranger's official hand had reduced the whole of that 16 years of 16 good hands, the walk along the Schuylkill, the view she would have stood and looked at from the ridge, down to 4 words on a company letter. Confirmed lost. There has to be a mistake, he thought. Except there wasn't. The company wrote these things careful. They had to. There's law behind a letter like this. Insurance. Accounting, nobody sends a letter like this on a guess. Except boats catch fire in the dark and manifests get written by tired clerks holding lanterns with shaking hands, and names get misheard, and no, he was reaching. He knew he was reaching. A man reaches for anything in the first minute, rather than hold the thing that's actually been handed to him. A Miss P. Wynn. There could be more than one. Some small, cornered part of him tried. Wynn's not so rare a name. Except she told him herself, in the 6th letter, the exact boat, the exact week. And here was the exact boat, the exact week, and a name close enough to hers that the coincidence wasn't a comfort. At all, it was the whole of the horror right there, spelled out plain. He stopped reaching. A man can only hold a false hope up so long before his own arms give out under it. He folded the letter along its original creases. Slow, careful. The way a man folds something he already knows he will never be able to unfold and read again without this exact moment coming back whole. He put it in the pocket of his shirt, over his heart, which was, he would think later, the only decent place he could think to put a piece of paper that heavy. Pruitt was still talking. Zeke didn't hear the rest of it. He walked to the door of the trading post and stood in the doorway, looking up at the ridge, at the two lodgepole pines, at the cross that leaned a little in the wind the way it always leaned. And for the first time in 5 years, the sight of it did not comfort him at all, because he had done this once already, had learned the hard way exactly what the far side of losing a good woman felt like, and had told himself foolishly. He understood now, the way a man tells himself all manner of things to survive a winter, that a person only had to survive that particular hell once in a life. That the mountain, having taken Naomi, had settled its account with him, and moved on to other men's houses. The mountain, it turned out, kept no such books. He did not cry standing in that doorway. That was not a thing his body knew how to do anymore, not after Naomi, and he understood dimly that this was its own kind of damage, the kind a man carries so long he forgets it's damage at all and starts calling it strength instead. What he did instead was walk, out past the corral, up the switchback trail toward the ridge, the same trail he'd worn smooth over 5 years of grief walking. And he did not stop until he was standing at the foot of the two pines, looking down at a wooden cross that had, until an hour ago, marked the single worst thing that had ever happened to him. Until this. He stood there a long time. The valley below him doing what she had never gotten to see it do, the light sliding gold, then rust, then that blue that isn't quite dark, and he thought of a letter in a tin box under his counter that read, "A man who still grieves a good wife after 5 years is a man who knows how to love carefully. I would rather have that than a man who forgets easily." He had believed her, had built, letter by letter, an entire second chance out of the belief that a woman like Exit existed and was, at that very hour, somewhere on a river headed toward him. And now, there was a folded paper over his heart that said she never would arrive at all. The wind came up, off the peak, the way it always did at that hour, cold enough to sting, and Zeke Marsh stood between his first wife's grave and the empty place where his second life had been about to start, and did not move, for a long while, because there was nowhere left in him, just then, that had anywhere better to be. Below at the post, Pruitt untied his horse and rode back down the mountain alone, carrying nothing now but the weight of having been the one to bring it. Amos Teller came through 2 days later, on his regular circuit, expecting to trade a season's worth of pelts and find Zeke in the ordinary humor of a man counting down the days to something good. He found, instead, a man moving through his own trading post, like a stranger in it, going through the motions of weighing and counting and stacking, with a precision that had nothing warm left in it, the precision of a machine rather than a man. Marsh. Amos set his pelts on the counter and didn't reach for the ledger the way he usually did. "You look like hell's been through here twice and forgot something the first pass," Zeke told him. Flat, few words. The way he told anything that cost him something to say. Amos didn't offer the things men usually offered. "No, it'll get easier. No, the Lord has his reasons." None of the small worn coins of sympathy that get spent so often. They've lost most of their value by the time they change hands. He just stood there a moment, hat in his hands the way Pruitt's had been, and said the one true thing he had. "I'm sorry, Zeke. Real sorry. That's a hell of a thing to happen to a man twice." "It is," Zeke said, and that was the whole of the conversation, and it was, in its way, exactly enough. Amos didn't press for more, didn't linger with false comfort or leave too quick out of discomfort either. He traded his pelts at the fair price, same as any other week, because Zeke needed at least 1 hour of that day to feel ordinary, and left a sack of dried apples on the counter on his way out that hadn't been part of any trade, and never said a word about why. Word moved the way. Word moves through a scattered handful of trappers and traders who saw each other twice a month and called that neighborly slow but thorough. By the following week, 3 different men had found some excuse to stop at Cedar Hollow who had no real trading business there at all. And each of them had said some version of the same short, true thing. And none of them had asked Zeke to say more than he wanted to, because a mountain teaches its people, eventually, that the kindest thing you can offer a grieving man is your presence and not your questions. Zeke went about the ranch work in the days after with the same disciplined regularity he brought to everything. Because the horses needed feeding, and the traps needed checking, and the mountain did not pause for a man's grief, which he had learned once already, and was, in some complicated way, grateful to already know. The ridge looked the same in the evenings. The two pines held their color the way they always had. The finished room stayed finished. The curtain stayed hung. He did not go back in to take it down, could not quite make himself do that yet, and told himself it was simply that he hadn't gotten to it the way. A man tells himself a great many small untruths in the first hard days of a grief he thought he'd already survived once, and should not, by any fair accounting, have been asked to survive twice. On the fourth night he went in anyway, not to dismantle it. He told himself that plainly, standing in the doorway with a candle in his hand, the way he told himself most things now plainly, or not at all. He sat in the chair by the window, the one he'd set there guessing at a taste he'd never had the chance to learn. The cedar bed frame held the candlelight along its planed edges, smooth as anything he'd ever built, and he ran a hand along the headboard, the way a man touches a thing he made with some hope attached to it, checking, without quite admitting that was what he was doing, whether the hope had gone out of the wood, along with everything else. It hadn't entirely. That surprised him. 6 letters worth of a woman he'd never met had left more behind than a single company letter. Seemed like it ought to be able to erase, and some low, stubborn part of him, the same part that had jumped into a spring-melt creek once without waiting for his mind to finish deciding, was not yet willing to call the whole of it finished. He didn't examine that feeling too closely. Didn't trust it. Exactly. A man who has been wrong about survival before learns not to lean too hard on a feeling before it's proven itself steady. But he sat in the chair a long while all the same, candle burning low, the plain blue curtain hanging still in the windless dark, and did not, in the end, take it down. He did not know, splitting wood in the gray of that 6th morning, that a stagecoach was rolling steadily toward the very fort where his last letter had been posted, carrying, among its handful of tired passengers, a woman whose name had been correctly spelled and correctly accounted for from the very first mile of her journey, a woman who was, at that hour, watching the same eastern light come up over unfamiliar country, thinking of a man on a ridge she had never yet seen, and wondering, with a plain and steady hope that matched his own letters word for word, whether he would turn out to be exactly the man those letters had promised her he was. The fire started small. That was the part nobody at the company office would ever put in a letter, because small didn't sound like tragedy, and tragedy was what paid for the ink. A lamp bracket, loose since St. Louis. A curtain, cheap muslin hung too close to the wick by a decorator who'd never once imagined a boat catching a swell mid-river at the wrong hour. It caught at 11 at night in the forward cabins, while most of the Missouri rows slept the particular dead sleep of people who have spent 3 days doing nothing but watching a riverbank slide by. Prudence woke to smoke before she woke to sound. That was how she'd remember it after smell first, a wrongness in the air before her mind had caught up enough to name it, and then the shouting started. And then everything after that happened too fast to sort into a proper order. She was 2 cabins back from patients. She didn't think about that. Not in the moment. In the moment there was only the corridor, black with smoke low and clearer up high, and a crewman's voice somewhere ahead of her, yelling for everyone to the stern, and her own hands finding the wall, finding the next door, finding the next. Patience's door was already hot. She hammered on it anyway. Called the girl's name, once, twice, and got nothing back but the roar of something that had already gone past the point where a name could reach it. A crewman pulled her back by the arm, hard enough to bruise. "She's gone, ma'am. You can't—" "She's not gone. She's 20 years old, and asleep. Get this door." Except the door didn't open, and the smoke came up thicker, and the man's grip on her arm didn't loosen, and somewhere in the space of the next 30 seconds, Prudence Wynne understood, with a clarity that would sit in her chest for the rest of her life, that some doors do not open in time, and no amount of will or shears or steady hands changes that fact, once it has already been decided by fire. "Go back," some part of her insisted. "You can't just leave her." except you can. That was the whole horror of it. A body can be made to leave almost anywhere if the smoke gets thick enough and how strong enough on your arm, and the mind keeps arguing right up until the legs have already carried it 3 doors down the corridor, moving on instructions the mind never actually gave. She would think, later, that this was the cruelest thing about surviving. Not the fire itself. The fact that her own body had chosen to live before she'd finished deciding whether it was allowed to. She went. God help her. She went, and hated herself for it, in the particular way a person hates themselves. For the sensible choice, the one that keeps them alive, the one that means somebody else's name gets read out later on a list of the lost instead of their own. The corridor behind her had gone from black to orange by the time she reached the stern, and the last thing she heard from that end of the boat, before the crew's shouting swallowed everything else, was a sound she would spend the rest of her life trying not to remember and never quite managing to forget. Her own left forearm had caught against a door handle, gone molten somewhere in that last scramble down. The corridor, she didn't feel it happen, only noticed the burn afterward, on the open deck, when the cold night air found it and the pain finally caught up to the moment that had caused it. A small mercy, that delay. It meant she'd had both hands free when they'd mattered most. The crew fought the fire 20 minutes. Contained it to the forward cabins. Mostly, though mostly was a word that meant nothing to the 6 families whose whole lives had been in those cabins' trunks an hour before. The Missouri Rose limped to the nearest landing, under her own steam, paddle wheel groaning, and put ashore a crowd of frightened, smoke-stained passengers onto a dock lit by 2 lanterns and staffed by one exhausted clerk who had never in his life had to account for a boatload of the living and the dead in the same tired hour. He worked from a passenger manifest scorched black along one edge, called names into the dark, checked them against a list, half of which he could no longer read clearly by lantern light, in handwriting not his own, smudged with soot from hands that had carried the ledger through smoke, to save it. Win. He'd called it twice. 2 women had answered, one from the crowd on the dock, one not at all, because the girl who should have answered was 3 decks below past answering, and the clerk working too fast in too little light with too many names left to call, made the mark against the wrong entry and moved on to the next before anyone thought to correct him. Prudence didn't know it happened. Nobody told her that night, or the next morning, or for 6 more days, because nobody at that landing had any reason to think a clerical error made in exhaustion and grief would travel 400 miles west and break a man's heart on a mountain he'd never seen her set foot on. What she knew, standing on that dock with a bandage a doctor's wife had wound around her forearm, was that Patience Wynne, 20 years old, bright, easy with her own name, and generous with her laugh, traveling to a brother who did not yet know he'd lost her, was not among the passengers being counted alive. She sat up most of that night, on a bench outside the landing's one boarding house, arm throbbing under its bandage, and grieved a girl she'd known 4 days, the way a person grieves someone they'd expected to know for 40 years. The landing itself was little more than a scatter of buildings thrown up wherever the river had decided that season to let a dock hold a boarding house, a chandler's, a church with a bell too small for the size of its ambitions, all of it lit that night by lanterns, carried out from the boarding house kitchen and set along the porch rail, so the IFAR survivors could see one another's faces well enough to be counted and comforted, and counted again by anyone who couldn't quite believe the numbers the first time through. A woman from the church came out near midnight with a pot of coffee and a stack of borrowed blankets, and asked no questions of anyone, simply moved from bench to bench, setting a cup in whatever hands would take one, and when she reached Prudence, she paused a moment, longer than she had at the others, taking in the bandage, the soot still gray in her hair, the particular stillness of a person holding herself together by main force. "You lost someone," the woman said. "Not a question either. A friend. 4 days' worth of one. It shouldn't feel the size it does. Grief doesn't measure itself by the calendar, dear. Only by how much room a person made in your life while they were in it. The woman set the cup in her hands, folded Prudence's fingers around it, the way a person folds a child's fingers around something precious. Though Prudence was 31 years old and had not been mothered like that since she was 14. Drink that. Then write whoever's waiting on you, if anyone is. Waiting's its own kind of grief when the news runs slow. Prudence drank the coffee, and in the morning she wrote 2 letters. The first was short and went to the brother whose name she had, care of the fort, where he'd staked his claim, because somebody had to tell him plain, and it was not going to be a company clerk's smudged ledger that did it. The second was to Zeke, Mr. Marsh. There was a fire aboard the Missouri Rose on the night of the 6th. I want you to know before any other word reaches you that I am alive and largely unharmed, a small burn on my arm, already healing, nothing that will slow me. There was another woman aboard who shared my name near enough to cause confusion in the dark, and I fear the company's accounting of that night may not be accurate when it reaches you. I did not lose my life. I lost a friend of 4 days, a young woman named Patience, who I will grieve the rest of my own. I will be delayed reaching the fort. The boat needs repair, and I mean to go on by the overland stage instead of waiting on it. I should still reach you before the month is out. I am telling you this so that whatever word travels ahead of me, you will have the truer word behind it. She sealed it, paid the landing's postmaster double to see it sent express, and told herself, watching him tuck it into his bag, that she had done the one thing in her power to keep this from becoming worse than it already was. She had no way of knowing that 30 miles west, the spring thaw had brought down half a hillside across the very trail her letter needed to travel, and that the company's official notice, cold, wrong, and 6 words long, had already left 2 days ahead of her on a faster route the landslide hadn't yet touched. Zeke did not know any of this, which was, in its way, the cruelest fact of the whole affair. That the truth existed, was written, was sealed and paid for, and sent, and simply could not travel fast enough to catch the lie that had gone ahead of it. He went about the ranch work in the days after Pruitt's visit with the same disciplined regularity he brought to everything, because the horses needed feeding, and the traps needed checking, and the mountain did not pause for a man's grief, which he had learned once already and was, in some complicated way, grateful to already know. But grief that returns a second time does not behave the way grief behaves the first. The first time, a man doesn't know yet that he'll survive it. The second time, he knows exactly what surviving costs, and knowing that in advance is its own particular weight, because there is no comfort left in this too shall pass. When a man has already watched it pass once and understood, with total clarity, that passing doesn't mean healing. It only means enduring long enough for the next thing to arrive. The next thing arrived on a gray morning 9 days after the letter, in the shape of a company agent named Josiah Crane, riding up from the fort with saddlebags full of paper and the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has never once had to worry which side of a debt he'd land on. Marsh. Crane didn't dismount right away. Looked the place over first, the way a buyer looks over a thing he's already decided what he wants. Fine morning. Company doesn't send you up here for weather reports, Crane. No. Crane sat down unhurried, pulled a folded paper from the saddlebag. Company sent me up here about the credit extended you last autumn. Traps, powder, the flour advanced through winter. Comes due end of the season. Marsh. He glanced at the paper, though Zeke suspected he already knew the number by heart. Men like Crane always did 60 days out. I'm aware of the terms. You're 2 seasons behind on the fur count against it. Trade's thinning out up here, same as everywhere else. Company's not in the business of extending patience it doesn't see repaid. Trade's thinning because your buyers pay half what they paid 5 years back for the same pelt, same work, same risk to a man's hide getting it. That's not on me, Crane. Might be true. Crane didn't look especially moved by the truth of it. Doesn't change the number at the bottom of that page. Zeke took the paper. Read the number at the bottom, the same number he'd been doing rough arithmetic in his head for a month or rough already, ever since the traps had started coming back lighter than they used to. 60 days. He turned the figure over in his mind the way a man turns over a stone too heavy to lift outright, looking for some angle that might make it lighter. 60 days, and the traps bringing in less each week instead of more. 60 days, and half his usual trapping hours already lost to a grief that hadn't let him sleep past 4 in the morning in a month. 60 days, and no wife's second income to lean on now. No partner splitting the load, which was its own small, ugly thought, one he was ashamed of the moment it surfaced, because he hadn't asked Prudence West to be a solution to a debt. He'd asked her West because the house was too quiet. The debt had simply arrived after, uninvited. The way debts always did, indifferent to whatever else a man was already carrying. And the pelts he did have weren't near enough to close the gap. And the alternative, the one Crane didn't say out loud but had clearly come prepared to discuss if Zeke gave him the opening, was the deed to Cedar Hollow itself, offered against the balance, the company taking the post and the land under it in trade for a debt a dead trapping economy had made impossible to outrun. "I'll have it," Zeke said. Flat. The same flat voice he'd used on Pruitt, on Amos, on every hard thing that had come at him since the letter arrived. "Hope you do, Marsh." Crane folded the receipt of delivery, tucked it away. "Hate to see a man lose a place he built with his own hands. But the company's not sentimental. Never has been." He rode off, without asking after the trading post's usual talk the bride who'd been expected, the wedding that hadn't happened because word of that particular grief hadn't reached the company's business channels yet, and wouldn't, and Crane wouldn't have cared if it had. A debt was a debt whether a man's heart was broken or whole. Zeke stood in the yard a long while after the dust of Crane's horse had settled, the paper in his hand, 60 days scrawled across the bottom of it in a company clerk's careless hand. A second deadline now, stacked on top of a grief he hadn't finished the first lap of, and he thought, standing there, the mountain does not stagger its blows to be kind. It never has. It simply sends them, one after another, and calls the surviving of them a virtue, when half the time it's only exhaustion wearing a virtue's clothes. Word of the debt didn't travel the way word of the bride's death had. Debt was a private shame in a country where a man's worth was measured in what he could hold on to with his own two hands. But the bride, everyone already knew about, and everyone, in the particular blunt way of men who spend 6 months a year alone in the wilderness and forget the finer points of tact somewhere around the second winter, had an opinion. Zeke rode down to the fort a week after Crane's visit, on the excuse of trading what pelts he had against the debt, and found the trading room crowded with trappers waiting out a spring storm, among them a broad, loud man named Ferris, who worked the southern line and had never once, in Zeke's knowledge of him, said a careful thing when a crude one would do. "Marsh." Ferris raised a cup toward him, half salute, half mockery. "Heard about your bride. Heard wrong. Most likely. Heard she went up in smoke on a riverboat before you ever laid eyes on her." Ferris grinned around the room, playing to it. "Hell of a way to lose a woman you never met. What'd you even know about her?" Name and a number, same as ordering flour. The room had gone quiet in the particular way. Rooms go quiet when they smell a fight starting and aren't sure yet whether to watch or step back. "I knew her," Zeke said. "Knew her." Ferris laughed, short and ugly. "Knew a fat woman's handwriting is what you knew. Heard that much too big as a barn door, they say, from the letters she wrote about herself. Man like you could have had his pick and you go and order the—" He didn't finish it. Zeke crossed the room in 4 strides and had a fistful of Ferris's collar before the sentence found its last word, and the room went from quiet to dead silent, every man in it suddenly very interested in his own cup. "Say the rest of that," Zeke said. Low, level. The kind of level that scared men more than shouting ever did. "Go on. Finish it." Ferris's grin had gone somewhere entirely. "Easy, Marsh. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word." Zeke's grip didn't loosen. "That woman wrote me 6 letters, Ferris. Told me the truth about herself before I ever had the chance to find fault with it on my own, which is more honesty than you've managed in the 10 years I've known you. She wasn't ashamed of her own body, and I'll be damned if I'll stand in a room and let a man who's never built a single honest thing in his life mock her, for the one quality you don't have enough of yourself to recognize when you hear it. She's dead, Marsh. Ferris said it quiet now, almost gentle, the fight gone out of him. Don't much matter what you defend anymore. It, it matters to me. Zeke let go. Stepped back. It'll matter to me whether she's alive to hear it or not. That's the difference between a man who loved somebody and a man who was only renting the idea of her. He left his pelts on the counter, took his credit against the debt, and walked out without looking back at the room. And behind him the silence held a long moment before somebody finally found the nerve to speak again. Low, to no one in particular, never seen Marsh like that. Corliss caught him at the door. The quartermaster hadn't said a word through the whole exchange, had simply watched from behind the counter the way he watched most things at that fort. But he followed Zeke out into the cold and stood with him a moment while the horse was brought round. Ferris talks before he thinks, Corliss said. Always has. Don't mean the rest of us think the same. Didn't figure you did. For what it's worth, Marshman doesn't defend a woman's honor that hard over somebody he was only settling for. Whatever you had building in those letters, it was real. I've seen enough false courtships pass through this fort to know the differences. It wasn't much. A few words from a man who dealt mostly supply counts and mail routes, not comfort. But Zeke found, riding back up the mountain after, that it sat with him longer than he'd expected proof, small as it was, that not every man in this country measured a woman's worth the way Ferris had, and not every man measured Zeke's grief as something to be mocked rather than honored. He didn't feel triumphant riding back up the mountain. He felt something closer to hollow a man defending a woman's honor, he believed. With his whole broken heart, he'd never get the chance to defend to her face. The stage that carried Prudence Wynn west out of the landing town held 5 passengers and a driver who talked to his horses more than to any of them. And among the 5 was a woman named Mrs. Colby, traveling to join a husband already established at a mining camp 2 days past the fort, who had spent the first morning of the journey studying Prudence with the particular unhurried disapproval of a woman accustomed to having her opinions received as fact. You're going to be married, Mrs. Colby said. On the second afternoon, not quite a question. I am. Mail order. Not unkind exactly, just certain of its own superiority. I confess I find the whole business rather desperate. A woman ought to be chosen, not shipped. A woman ought to choose too, Mrs. Colby. I'll grant you most arrangements don't leave much room for that. Mine did. Did it? Mrs. Colby's eyes did the same unhurried pass. Mrs. Holloway's had done, weeks and a whole country ago. And what, precisely, made a mountain trapper willing to take on a woman of your build sight unseen? Prudence had spent 16 years perfecting the particular stillness required to hear a sentence like that, and let nothing show. She used it now. The same thing that made me willing to answer him, she said, honesty. He wrote plain. I answered. Plain. Neither of us wasted the other's time pretending to be something we weren't. That's a very tidy answer. It's a true one. Those aren't always the same thing, but this time they happen to be. You don't seem troubled by my asking. I've had the question put to me a good deal less politely than you've managed, Mrs. Colby. I'm not troubled. I'm just no longer interested in apologizing for the answer, Mrs. Colby said further that day. But she watched Prudence a good deal more closely after that, the way a person watches someone they've decided to keep proving wrong. The storm caught them on the 3rd day, in the foothills, where the trail narrowed along a ridge with a drop on one side, steep enough that the driver had been white-knuckled on the rain since noon, even before the sky went the color of a fresh bruise. It came fast, the way spring storms did in that country, snow first, then whined hard enough to flatten it sideways, then a white so total the lead horses couldn't be seen from the driver's box. The stage lurched, one wheel finding the trail's soft shoulder, and tipped hard enough that Mrs. Colby went from her seat to the floor, with a cry that had more fear in it than the fall alone should have earned. My ankle. She said it through her teeth, face gone white. Something's wrong, I can't. The driver was fighting the horses. Couldn't leave the box, not in that wind, not with the drop so close on the one side, which left the cabin to sort itself, 4 passengers and a woman down. in a dark gone total, and a cold coming through the cracked door like a living thing. Prudence moved before she'd finished deciding to. She had her shears out of her bag. Before the others had found their voices, cut a length of the Boston wool. She'd been 3 years for a reason she hadn't known until now. This, it turned out, was the reason. Or, near enough, and bound Mrs. Colby's ankle fast and tight, the same steady hands that had fitted 100 gowns to 100 difficult bodies, finding the shape of a swollen joint and setting it as sure as she'd ever set a hem. Hold still, not unkind, just certain. I've splinted worse than this with less light. You've splinted an ankle? I've splinted my own thumb 3 times and a client's wrist once, and neither of them thanked me kindly for how much it hurt in the moment. Hold still. The other passengers she put to work, without asking whether they wanted the job, one holding the lantern stood empty against the wind, coming through the door, one bracing Mrs. Colby's shoulders, one passing up the spare blankets from beneath the seat, because a person in shock chilled faster than a person calm, and calm was the one thing Prudence could offer that cost nothing and mattered more than anything else in that cabin just then. The wheel that had found the soft shoulder had not, it turned out, found solid ground beneath it. A second lurch, worse than the first, tipped the whole coach another few degrees toward the drop, and this time it was the young man across from her, a clerk headed to a post past the fort, no older than 22, and plainly out of his depth, who went white and started for the door. On the low side, the wrong side, the side that dropped away into a ravine he couldn't see through the snow, but every instinct in his panicking body was pulling him toward anyway. Not that door. Prudence caught his sleeve hard before he'd got it more than halfway open. Look at me. Not that door. We're going over. We're going to. We are not going over. This coach has been sitting on that shoulder 2 full minutes, and it hasn't moved another inch. That's not luck, that's weight distribution. And you climbing out that side is the one thing that could actually tip us the rest of the way. Sit back. Down. He sat, shaking, but he sat, and Prudence held his sleeve a moment longer than she needed to, the way a person holds onto a thing until they're sure it's actually going to stay put, and then let go, and went back to the ankle, because there was still work to finish in panic. Once caught, spread faster than the cold did. The storm held them 2 hours. When it broke enough for the driver to find the trail again, Mrs. Colby's ankle was bound tight enough to bear weight wrapped in Boston wool that would never again be anything but a bandage, and the woman looked at Prudence in the gray afterlight with an expression that had nothing of the levy's disapproval left in it at all. I judged you unfairly, Mrs. Colby said. Quiet, plain, almost. In a way Prudence recognized, because it was the same plainness she'd learned to prize in Zeke's letters. I'm sorry for it. You're not the first, Prudence said. You won't be the last, most likely. But I'll say this for you, you're the first to say sorry, out loud, instead of just thinking better of me in private and calling that enough. Mrs. Colby didn't answer that, just reached over, in the cramped dark of the recovering stage, and took Prudence's hand and held it the rest of the way down out of the foothills. And neither of them said anything more about it, because some things a person says once, and then simply lives by after. The fort was 2 days off still when the stage finally reached level ground, and Prudence, exhausted, her arm aching under its bandage in the cold, sat with her forehead against the cold glass, and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since the landing. She was behind schedule, badly behind. The letter she'd sent, explaining everything, should have reached him by now, should have reached him well before any official word could, if the postmaster's promise of an express route had held true. She didn't know it hadn't. Didn't know that 30 miles back, a hillside's worth of spring mud had taken the trail out entire, and that her letter sat, at that very hour, in a writer's undelivered pouch at a relay station, waiting on a road crew to clear a way through while the company's cold wrong 6-word notice had already done its damage on a mountain 400 miles ahead, a full week and more, before her own true words would ever get the chance to catch it. She thought of Zeke reading her 6th letter, thought of him doing the same arithmetic she was doing now. counting days, watching a ridge for a rider who hadn't come yet. She had no way of knowing he was no longer watching that ridge for good news at all, that somewhere ahead of her, past 2 more days of hard travel and a mountain she hadn't yet laid eyes on. A man who believed her dead was standing in a yard with a company debt notice in his hand, doing arithmetic of an entirely different, entirely crueler kind. The 60 days Crane had given him did not feel like 60 days. They felt, from the inside, like a single unbroken hour, stretched thin enough to cover 2 months because grief does strange things to a man's sense of time, compresses it and stretches it in the same breath, until a week can pass in what feels like an afternoon, and a single evening can feel like it's lasted a season. Zeke worked the traps harder than the game up there could rightly support, because working was the only thing that quieted the particular arithmetic running. Underneath everything else he did, the debt on one side, the pelts coming in on the other, the gap between them not closing no matter how early he rose or how late he stayed out on the line. Amos came through twice more in those weeks, and each time found the gap a little wider, the man behind the counter a little grayer around the eyes, and each time said less, because there was less and less that seemed worth saying to a friend, circling a decision that had no good version left in it. On the second visit, though, he stayed longer than usual, sat across the counter with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and finally said the thing he'd clearly been turning over the whole write-up. "You could sell to me," Amos said. "Not the company. Me. I've got a little put by. Wouldn't cover the whole debt, but it'd buy you time. And time's the thing you're short on, not character. Wouldn't be right, Amos. You've got your own line to run, your own hard winters coming. Wouldn't be right for you to lose this place over pride either. It's not pride." Zeke said it quiet. "It's arithmetic. Yours wouldn't close the gap any better than mine does. Just moves the debt from a company that doesn't care about me to a friend who does. And I'll be damned if I let this mountain cost you the way it's already cost me." Amos hadn't argued that further. Just finished his coffee, cold as it was, and rode back down the mountain with the offer still standing, unspoken but understood, the way real offers between real friends usually stayed. The finished room stayed finished. The curtain stayed hung. He still hadn't taken it down, and by the 5th week he'd stopped even pretending to himself that he meant to had simply let it become a room he didn't go into. The way a man lets a wound scab over by refusing to look at it, which isn't healing. Not really. Only a kind of waiting dressed up to look like patience. By the 8th week, with the deadline, 11 days off, and the pelts still short by a margin no honest arithmetic could close, Zeke sat at his kitchen table one evening, with Crane's paper spread flat under the lamp, and did, for the first time, the thing he'd been avoiding since the debt collector rode away. He let himself imagine signing it. The company would take the post, take the land under it, the barn he'd raised with 2 neighbors and a summer's worth of sandwiches, the ridge with the 2 lodgepole pines, and the plain wooden cross beneath them, though he understood, reading the fine print twice to be sure, that a company deed didn't extend to a grave, that some things even a hard trade couldn't touch, and that was the one mercy in the whole cold arrangement, thin as it was. He would go where? That was the part his mind kept sliding off of, the way a boot slides off ice it hasn't found purchase on yet. East, maybe. Back to the kind of country that didn't ask a man to bury this much in one lifetime, and still call it living. Before he could talk himself further down that road, he got up, crossed to the shelf behind the counter, took down the tin box, 6 letters. He hadn't opened it since the day the death notice arrived, had told himself there was no good reason to reread words from a woman who'd never get the chance to write in 7th, and yet here he was, hands not quite steady, lifting the lid anyway. He read them in order, all 6. The plain first letter, the one about her body, the one that had cost her more to write than he'd fully understood it until he'd had 5 weeks of grief to sit with it. The one about the shears, her mother's shears, carried west for a reason she hadn't known until she'd known it. A man who still grieves a good wife after 5 years is a man who knows how to love carefully. I would rather have that than a man who forgets easily. He closed the box. sat with his hand flat on the lid a long while, the way she must sat with her hand flat on that first envelope, not knowing yet whether it would land anywhere at all. Sign it, some tired, practical part of him said. Cut your losses. A dead woman's letters aren't worth a man's whole future. Except they're not just a dead woman's letters. Some other part answered back, quieter, more stubborn. They're the last honest thing that happened to you. And a man doesn't trade the last honest thing he has for the first easy way out, not if there's 11 days left to try for something better. He sat with the pen in his hand a long while that night, didn't sign it, told himself it was because the deadline hadn't come yet, because there was still time, because 11 days was 11 days and a man owed himself the dignity of using every one of them before he gave up the only home he'd built with his own two hands. That was the story he told himself. The truer story, the one he didn't say, out loud, even alone at his own kitchen table, was that some small, stubborn, unreasonable part of him, the same part that had once jumped into a spring-melt creek without waiting for his mind to finish deciding, was still, against every fact the company letter had handed him, waiting on a rider who hadn't come yet. He put the pen down, blew out the lamp, and lay awake a long while in the dark, listening to the wind come up off the peak the way it always did, and did not yet know that the woman he was waiting on was, at that very hour, 2 days out and closing riding toward a fort, and a mountain, and a man she had never once stopped believing was worth the whole hard distance between them. The stage rolled into the fort on a gray afternoon, mud thrown up past the wheel hubs, the horses blowing hard from the last stretch of trail. Prudence was down off the step before the driver had fully set the brake, trunk forgotten a moment behind her, scanning the yard with the particular hunger of a person who has spent 4 weeks imagining a single face and is not yet sure her imagination got it right. She didn't see him. Corliss came out from the quartermaster's office at the commotion, wiping his hands on a rag, and took her in the bandage still faintly visible at her wrist where the sleeve had ridden up. The trunk, the look on her face, and something in his own expression shifted, fast, from professional courtesy to a kind of careful alarm. Ma'am, you'll forgive me, but you're not Miss Wynne, the one that was on the Missouri Rose. I am Miss Wynne. She heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. Why do you ask it like that? Corliss didn't answer right away, which was, in itself, an answer of a kind, and Prudence felt something go cold in her chest that had nothing to do with the mountain air. There was word, he said finally. Careful. The way a man is careful handling something he already suspects break in his hands regardless. Company letter came through some weeks back. Had been lost in the fire? Said you'd been lost in. I sent a letter of my own. From the landing, explaining I hadn't been. Didn't reach here, ma'am. Not that I've seen. Corliss glanced toward the trail north, the one that climbed toward Cedar Hollow, as if the answer might be sitting somewhere along it. There was a landslide took out the upper trail near a month back. Road crews still clearing it. Mail's been running the long way round since, when it's running at all. Prudence stood very still. 4 weeks. He had believed her dead for 4 weeks, and her own letter sealed, paid for, sent express, the one true thing she'd trusted to outrun the lie, had simply never arrived to correct it. Is he here? She asked. Mr. Marsh? Is he at the fort? No, ma'am. Hasn't been down but twice since the letter came through. Once to trade pelts. Once Corliss stopped himself, seemed to weigh how much was his to tell, and settled on the plain version. The way most men at that fort eventually settled on the plain version with her. She was coming to notice, the same way Zeke always had in his letters. Once to take a beating he didn't throw the first punch on, defending your name to a man who'd no business running his mouth about it. He's up at Cedar Hollow now, alone, far as I know. Man, a rough soul, ma'am, and I don't say that to alarm you. I say it because you asked, and you struck me as a woman who'd rather have the truth than the comfortable version of it. I would. Prudence looked north, toward a mountain she had never seen, gray with distance and the last of the day's cloud cover, somewhere behind which a man believed the whole of his second chance had burned up on a river he'd never once laid eyes on. How far to Cedar Hollow from here? Day and a half by wagon this time of year. Longer if the trail's soft. Is there a wagon I can hire tonight? Corliss looked at her a long moment, travel-worn, arms still healing, trunk not yet unloaded from the stage she'd just stepped down from, and whatever protest he might have raised about the hour, or the cold, or the good sense of resting a night first, seemed to die somewhere behind his teeth when he took the full measure of her face. I'll have one ready within the hour, he said. Man like Marsh has waited long enough on good news, ma'am. Don't see why. He ought to wait one night more than he has to. The wagon rolled out of the fort just as the last light was going. Corliss's own driver at the reins. Prudence wrapped in every blanket the quartermaster could spare against a cold that deepened fast once the sun dropped behind the ridgeline ahead. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Sat with her hands folded in her lap, the bandage, on her wrist itching under the cold, and ran the same worry in a tight, useless circle the whole first hour of the climb. What if the 4 weeks changed him? What if a man can only survive losing a woman twice before something in him simply refuses to risk it a third time, refuses to open the door even when the knock turns out, this time, to be real? What if I've come all this way, only to find the letters were the best of him, and grief has worn down everything else? She caught herself on it, the way she'd learned to catch herself on every unkind thought a room or a mirror or her own tired mind had ever tried to hand her. No. She knew his handwriting better than she knew most men's faces. She knew he'd stood in a room full of strangers and defended a dead woman's honor when defending her cost him nothing and helped him less. That wasn't a man whose good qualities were only paper deep. That was a man built the way her mother's shears were built, plain steel. No ornament, true all the way through. The driver said little, watching the trail in the last of the light, and somewhere past the second hour, the wagon crested a rise, and the whole dark shape of the mountains opened up ahead of them, black against a sky just beginning to show its first hard stars, and Prudence Wynne sat forward in her seat, cold and travel-worn, and 4 weeks late by a lie that hadn't been true a single day of those 4 weeks, and watched the road climb on ahead of her, into the dark, toward a light she could not yet see, but trusted, with everything 16 years and one long river had taught her to trust, was still burning somewhere up there, waiting on her to arrive. The wagon reached Cedar Hollow just as the sky was going from black to the first thin gray that isn't yet morning, but has stopped being night. Prudence saw the trading post before she saw anything else about the mountain. 3 log buildings, a corral, smoke that should have been rising from the chimney and wasn't. No light in the windows. No sound but the wind coming down off the ridge behind it, and a horse in the corral that lifted its head at the wagon's approach and then put it back down, uninterested, the way an animal does when it has already learned that visitors don't mean much anymore. She was down off the wagon before the driver had the brake set, crossed the yard fast, her breath showing white in the cold, and found the trading post door shut. Not locked this was not. She would learn. A country that locked its doors but shut, and cold behind it, the hearth inside gone to ash the night before, and never relit. A single sheet of paper was pinned to the frame. She read it, standing in the doorway, the wind pulling at the edges of it, and felt something drop through her chest, the way a stone drops through still water fast and complete, and leaving nothing but rings behind it. Amos gone down to the fort to settle the company business. See to the horses if I'm not back by week's end. Sorry to leave it to you. ZM. Gone down to the fort to settle the company business. She didn't need to ask what that meant. Corliss's face, back at the fort, had already told her everything about the shape of that particular debt. And a man who'd spent 8 weeks refusing to sign a paper didn't ride down at first light on the last morning of his deadline unless he'd finally run out of every other option. He was signing it, right now. While she stood in a cold doorway on a mountain she'd crossed half a country to reach, he was 4 hours, back down the trail she'd just climbed, putting his name to a paper that would hand away the only home he'd ever built. Turn around, she told the driver, already climbing back into the wagon before the word was fully out of her mouth. Back to the fort. Now. Fast as these horses have got left in them. Ma'am, they've been driving all night. They can rest at the fort, please. She heard her own voice crack on the word, the first crack in it since Philadelphia, since the Halloways, since a fire on a river that had taken a girl named Patience and left a manifest to nearly take everything else besides. Please, I did not come this far to be 4 hours too late. The driver didn't argue further, turned the team, and the wagon lurched back down the switchbacks the way it had climbed them, only faster now, reckless in a way neither of them would have risked in daylight with a rested team. Prudence held the rail with both hands and did the only thing left to do, which was think, and thinking just then was its own particular torment. 4 hours. Maybe less if the roads held. Maybe more if they didn't. He's already there. Already signing. Ink's probably dry by now. Some cruel practical part of her mind offered, and she shoved the thought down hard, because a person cannot ride toward hope while also rehearsing its failure, not without the two canceling each other out entirely. He waited 8 weeks. 8 weeks of grief. He shouldn't have had to carry a second time in one life. And today, of all days, is the day I finally arrive, and I might still be too late by the length of a single signature. Except no, stop that. She caught herself, the way she'd learned to catch herself on 100 unkind thoughts before this one, in 100 rooms that had wanted her to believe the worst of her own chances. A man who kept a curtain hung 5 weeks past, believing it would ever matter again, is not a man who signs a paper easily. However tired he is of fighting the arithmetic, he'll have hesitated. He has to have hesitated. She held on to that. Held on to it, the whole 4 hours down, the wind cutting at her face, the trunk behind her rattling loose against its ropes, because it was the only thing in that entire desperate ride that felt like something she could actually do something about. Zeke had not slept the night before, had lain in the dark doing the arithmetic one final time, the way a man checks a wound he already knows is past saving, and found the same number waiting for him it had waited every night for 8 weeks. He'd risen before light, saddled the horse without breakfast, because eating felt like a thing a man did when he still had an appetite for the day ahead of him, and he didn't, not for this one. He'd pinned the note to the door with a nail from the same tin that held the tacks he'd used months back to hang a plain blue curtain in a room he'd built with his own 2 hands for a woman who was never going to see it. He rode down through the switchbacks with the cold biting at his fingers, and did not look back once at the ridge, at the 2 pines, at the cross he was leaving behind, because that, at least, no company deed could touch, and there was a strange, thin comfort in that single fact, the only comfort the whole morning had managed to offer him. He thought, riding, of the room, the cedar frame, the curtain he'd never taken down. Some fool, sentimental corner of him had considered, the night before, going in one last time to strip the room bare before he left it for a company inventory man to walk through with a clipboard and no understanding of what any of it had cost to build. He hadn't done it. Told himself there wasn't time. The truer reason, the one he didn't examine too closely at 4 in the morning, with a saddle already half cinched, was that stripping the room felt like a second funeral he didn't have the strength left in him to conduct. The fort came into view by mid-morning. Crane was waiting in the trading room with the papers already spread, unsurprised, the particular unhurried patience of a man who has never once doubted how a debt this size would end. Marsh. Crane didn't rise. Slid the paper across the counter, a pen laid neat beside it. Sensible of you. Some men make this harder than it needs to be. Don't mistake sensible for easy, Crane. Didn't say it was easy, said it was sensible. Crane tapped the line at the bottom. Sign there. We'll have a rider up to Cedar Hollow within the week to take inventory. Zeke picked up the pen, held it a long moment over the paper, the ink drying slightly at the nib, the way ink does when a hand hesitates too long over the page, and thought because his mind, even now, even here, would not stop doing this to him, of 6 letters, in a tin box 4 hours back up the mountain, and a plain blue curtain, and a woman's voice he'd never once heard, except in his own imagination, reading her words back to him in the quiet of his own kitchen. Sign it, the tired arithmetic in him said. There's no version of this morning where the numbers come out different. Except numbers were never the whole of what that letterbox held. Some other stubborner part answered back. And a man doesn't get to pretend, just because his hand's forced, that the parts a ledger can't measure don't count for anything at all. Grief is not a warning to me, Mr. Marsh. It's a reference. He set the pen to the paper. The sound that stopped him was not loud. That was the strange thing about it later. Trying to describe the moment to anyone who asked it wasn't a shout, wasn't a commotion, was only a woman's voice, calling a single word across a fort yard gone quiet with the business of an ordinary morning. Zeke. He knew the voice before his mind had finished arguing that it couldn't possibly be real. Knew it the way a person knows a thing in the body, before the mind has caught up to permit it, some old deep recognition, built out of 6 letters read so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, some quality of steadiness in the single syllable of his own name that no imagination could have invented whole cloth. He turned. She was standing 20 feet away in the fort yard, travel-worn, a bandage still faintly visible at her wristlet, hair come loose from its pins in a way 16 years of careful presentation would ordinarily never have allowed, and she was looking at him with an expression he had no name for, not relief exactly, not joy exactly, something that lived past both of those, in the specific territory of a person who has crossed half a country on the strength of 6 letters and a belief nobody else would have blamed her for abandoning. His legs did not hold him. He was aware of it happening the way a man is aware of weather. Not something he chose, not something he could have stopped. Simply a fact arriving from outside himself and moving through his body, regardless of what he intended. He went down onto one knee in the mud of the fort yard, the pen still somehow in his hand, the unsigned paper fluttering off the counter behind him in a gust neither of them noticed. And for one full second neither of them moved. The whole yard gone still around, the two of them, the particular way a room goes, still when it senses it is witnessing something too large for casual observation. Then she was crossing the yard. Fast, the way she'd crossed a burning corridor once already, for someone else's sake. And this time, there was no fire to pull her back from it. She knelt in front of him in the mud, in the same dress she'd traveled 2 days in, and put both hands to his face the way a person checks that something they've been told is broken, is in fact still whole. "You're alive," he said. It was not a question. It came out of him the way water comes out of a racked dam, not chosen, simply released, the whole pressure of 8 weeks behind it. "I'm alive." The letter said the letter was wrong. A young woman named Patience Wynne died on that boat, Zeke, and I have grieved her the whole way here. And I am so sorry it took this long for the truth to catch up to the lie. But I am alive. I have been alive the entire time. Her thumb moved along his jaw, an unconscious gesture, the kind a hand makes when it has been rehearsing this exact touch in imagination for 6 weeks of letters, and cannot quite believe it has finally arrived at the real thing. "I wrote you. From the landing. A landslide took the trail out before my letter could reach you. I was signing the deed." He said it plain, the way he said everything, even now, even undone. Right now. This second. If you'd been 30 seconds later. I wasn't. Her voice had the same steadiness it had carried through 6 letters, through a burning corridor, through a blizzard on a mountain road. "I wasn't later, Zeke. I'm here." He reached up, covered her hand where it rested against his jaw, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Because there are moments a voice only cheapens, and both of them, in their different plane cheapens, had learned that lesson somewhere in the long, hard months behind them. "I built you a room," he said finally. Quiet, almost embarrassed by it, the way a man is embarrassed by hope. Once it's finally been proven right instead of foolish. Cedar frame. Window I cut myself. Never once managed to take the curtain down, even after the letter came. Even after 8 weeks of telling myself I ought to. "Show me," she said. "When we get there. I want to see the room a stranger built for a woman on the strength of 6 letters." "You weren't a stranger." "No." She smiled at that, small and unsteady, the first real smile he'd seen crossed her face since she'd called his name across the yard. "I don't suppose I ever was." Crane, behind the counter, had gone very quiet. the unsigned paper still fluttering somewhere near his boots, and had the good sense, the only good sense he'd shown the whole exchange, to say nothing at all. They sat that evening in the fort's small guest room, a fire built up against the mountain cold, and told each other everything. The way two people tell each other things when they have finally run out of reasons to hold anything back. She told him about the fire, the corridor, the door that wouldn't open, the crewman's grip on her arm pulling her toward the life she hadn't been sure, in that moment, she deserved to keep. She told him about patience, the easy laugh, the joke about their shared name, the 4 days of friendship that had ended in a room full of smoke. Neither of them had ever imagined would be the last room either woman saw of each other. He listened the way she'd once listened to him, in a letter, about a fever and a closed pass, and 4 days at a bedside, with the full attention of a man who understood that some griefs only become bearable once they've been spoken, aloud to someone who will not flinch from hearing them. He told her in turn about the 8 weeks, the debt, Crane's visits. A man named Ferris Hudson said, an ugly thing in a crowded room, and what it had cost him to answer it, and what it had cost him more, every single day after, to keep believing in a woman he was certain he'd never get the chance to defend to her face. You defended me, she said. Quiet. Before you knew. I'd have defended you if I'd known for certain you were never coming. Some things don't wait on proof, Prudence. They just are what they are, whether the facts have caught up to them yet or not. What did he say? Ferris. Zeke was quiet a moment. Doesn't matter now. It matters to me. I'd like to know what you thought was worth a man's collar in your fist. He told her then, plain, the way he told everything, and watched her face while he did it, not for pity, but because he'd learned enough about her by then to know she wouldn't want it softened. She didn't flinch. Had heard worse, said gentler in a doorway on Chestnut Street. But something in her expression settled all the same. Hearing that a man 400 miles from anyone who'd ever call her family had chosen, without her there to witness it or thank him for it, to stand up in a room full of strangers and say her worth wasn't up for their debate. Corliss told me you'd taken a beating you didn't throw the first punch on, she said. He didn't say it was over that. Corliss talks more than he lets on. Corliss, she said, struck me as a man who says exactly as much as a situation needs and not one word more. I've come to trust that kind of talker more than the other sort. She was quiet a long moment, watching the fire, and then she reached into the trunk, beside her chair, the same trunk that had carried her mother's shears and 3 years of Boston wool, across half a country, and drew out a small tin box of her own, one he hadn't seen before, worn at the corners, the way a thing gets worn from years of careful handling. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to hear the whole of it before you decide what you think about it. All right. I have money, Zeke. Saved. 16 years of wages. Most of it never spent, because I always understood long before I ever answered your notice that a woman like me might need a way to stand on her own if a never happened at all, or happened and then fell apart the way marriages sometimes do. I didn't save it to rescue anyone. I saved it because a woman ought to have her own ground to stand on, whoever else is standing beside her. She opened the box. Inside, neat stacks of bills, more than he'd expected, more than 8 weeks of failing arithmetic had ever once let him imagine having in the same room as Crane's debt paper. It's enough to close the gap. Not charity, Zeke. Not a rescue. A decision. The same kind you made building a room for a woman you'd never met, on the strength of 6 letters and nothing else. I'm asking you to let me make one too. He looked at the box a long while. Something in him, the same old stubborn pride that had once told Amos wouldn't be right over a much smaller offer, rose up first, the way it always did, ready to refuse. Except this isn't Amos's money, he thought. This is hers. And a marriage where one person carries every hard thing alone isn't a partnership. It's just 2 people living politely in the same house. That's not how I pictured starting a marriage, he said finally, being saved by my own wife's wages before we've even said the vows. Then, don't picture it as being saved. She closed the box, set it between them, on the small table, where it caught the firelight along one worn corner. Picture it as two people who both spent years building something alone, finally building the next thing together instead. That's not rescue, Zeke. That's just what partnership looks like, when neither person's too proud to let the other one carry a fair share of the weight. He didn't answer that right away. Reached out instead slow and put his hand over the box, over her hand still resting on its lid, and left it there a long moment, the fire cracking softly in the grate, the whole weight of 8 impossible weeks settling, finally, into something that felt almost like rest. "All right," he said. "Together then." Crane took the payment 2 mornings later, with considerably less ceremony than he'd brought to the signing table, counted it twice out of habit rather than suspicion, and wrote out a receipt marking the debt closed in a hand that showed no more feeling about the matter than it had about anything else in the whole cold business. "Company'll be disappointed," he said, folding the receipt. "Land like that would have fetched a fair price." "Company'll manage," Zeke said, and did not offer him so much as a nod on the way out the door. Amos rode down the moment word reached him, which took less than a day, mountainward, traveling the way it always did. He found Zeke and Prudence sitting together on the fort's guest room porch, the receipt still sitting between them on the small table where the bind box had sat two before, at moment, taking in the two of them before he said anything at all. "You're alive," he said to Prudence, plain as anyone else had managed it. "I am." And he turned to Zeke, something working in his face that looked, for a man like Amos, dangerously close to being moved. "You didn't take my offer. Took hers instead. Wasn't a competition, Amos." Didn't say it was. Amos sat down heavy in the porch's third chair, uninvited, the way old friends sit down. "Just glad somebody finally talked sense into you. That pride's a poor substitute for a full ledger. Took a woman 400 miles away to manage what I couldn't in 8 weeks of trying." "She wasn't 400 miles away by the time it mattered," Prudence said. "Only close enough to arrive in time." "There's a difference." Amos looked between the two of them a long moment, then shook his head, laughing low under his breath, the particular laugh of a man conceding a point he'd been happy to lose. "Well, whatever the arithmetic of it, Marsh, I'll say this much: you built that room on faith, and faith paid the debt in the end. Not sure I've got much better proof than that a man ought to keep believing past the point sense tells him to quit." Nobody argued that. There wasn't much left, that afternoon, worth arguing about at all. They were married 8 days later, in the small chapel at the fort, by a circuit preacher who happened through on his regular route and seemed, by his own account, delighted to officiate something with rather less grief attached to it than the burials that made up most of his mountain business that season. Amos stood witness, having ridden down the moment word reached him, and cried more openly at the ceremony than either of the two people actually getting married, a fact he denied for years afterward, and nobody who'd been present ever let him forget. Corliss came too, in his one good coat, and Mrs. Colby passing back through the fort on her way to her mining camp husband, ankle healed enough by then to stand the whole ceremony without complaint, sat in the second row, with an expression Prudence had never once expected to see on that particular face when they'd first shared a stage together. Unguarded, uncomplicated happiness for a woman she'd spent one blizzard learning to see clearly. Even Ferris showed, hat in his hands at the back of the small chapel, and said nothing through the whole service, and left before the reception. But Zeke noted the gesture all the same, and understood it for what it was: the closest thing a man like that would ever manage, and worth accepting as one. Prudence wore the Boston wool. Not the whole bolt, she'd used most of it, binding a stranger's ankle in a blizzard, and found she didn't regret a single yard of that trade, but enough of what remained to make a dress plain and well cut and entirely her own, no borrowed pattern, no fashion plate's idea of what a bride ought to look like. She had made it herself in the 4 evenings between the fort and the wedding, and it fit her exactly the way 16 years of practice had taught her. A garment should fit a body, not the other way around. They rode back up to Cedar Hollow together the following week, the wagon loaded with her trunk and his supplies both, and Prudence saw the trading post in daylight. For the first time, the three log buildings, the corral, the ridge, rising behind it all the way up to two lodgepole pines. She recognized instantly from 6 weeks of letters, though she'd never once laid eyes on them before that afternoon. Zeke showed her the finished room first. Stood in the doorway watching her take in the cedar bed frame, the eastern window he'd cut himself over 2 cold mornings, the plain blue curtain he'd never once managed to take down, not through 8 weeks of grief, not through a single night when hope had felt like the most foolish thing a man could still be carrying. "You built this before you'd ever met me," she said. "Quiet. I built it on the strength of 6 letters. Seemed like enough at the time. Turned out to be exactly enough." She walked the room slow, trailing a hand along the headboard, and then turned to him with a question she'd been carrying since the first letter mentioned the ridge behind the post. "Will you take me up to see her?" "Naomi, I'd like to, if that's a thing you're willing to share." He hadn't expected the asking, had half assumed without ever quite deciding it outright, that a new wife might prefer the first one left unmentioned, the grave visited alone, or not at all. Something in his chest loosened, hearing the offer instead, the way it had loosened once reading her third letter, the one about her own body, told plain because she'd trusted him enough to risk it. "I'd like that," he said. They climbed the switchback trail together in the last of the afternoon light, and Prudence stood a long moment at the foot of the 2 pines, looking at the plain wooden cross, leaning a little in the wind, the way it always leaned, the way Zeke had described it in a letter written 6 weeks and a lifetime ago. "I never knew her," Prudence said, finally. "But I know what kind of man she loved well enough to leave behind grieving her honestly for 5 years, instead of pretending it away. That tells me most of what I need to know about the woman herself. Thank you for loving her the way you did. I don't think I'd trust the way you love me half so much if I hadn't seen the shape of that first." Zeke didn't answer right away. Stood with his hand resting on the top of the leaning cross, the way he'd stood there 100 evenings alone. Except this time there was another set of footprints beside his in the thin mountain grass. And that, he understood, standing there, was the whole of what had changed, not the grief, which hadn't left and never fully would, but the fact that he no longer had to carry it in a silence built for one. "She'd have liked you," he said. "I told her that once, up here, alone, before I knew whether I'd ever get the chance to prove it true. Then I hope she's not too disappointed. It took a fire and a landslide and a company clerk's bad handwriting to finally get me here." He laughed at that, a real laugh. The first one Prudence had heard out of him since the fort yard, short and surprised out of him, the way laughter sometimes is when it arrives from underneath a great deal of grief that had forgotten for a while. That laughing was still an option available to a man who'd survived this much. That evening, with the fire built up and the last of the daylight sliding gold, then rust, then that held breath blue across the valley, exactly the way he'd promised her it would. 6 weeks and a lifetime ago, Zeke took the death letter from the tin box under the counter, the one he'd carried in his shirt pocket, over his heart, on the worst single day of a life that had already asked too much of him twice, and crossed to the hearth. "Together," she said, and put her hand over his, on the folded paper. They fed it to the fire side by side, and watched it take, the old official ink curling and blackening and finally gone. And neither of them said anything further about it, because some things a person only needs to receive once, properly, in front of the one person who'd earned the right to watch them do it. The sewing lessons started that first autumn, almost by accident, the way the truest good things in a life often do. A trapper's wife from the lower valley rode up to Cedar Hollow, needing a coat let out before the hard cold came, and stayed the better part of an afternoon watching Prudence work, and asked, near the end of it, whether she might come back and learn the trick of it herself. By the following spring, there were 4 women making the ride up regular. Then 6, then enough that Zeke built a second table in the front room of the post without being asked, because he'd learned, in a single hard season, to recognize what a thing was becoming before anyone had to explain it to him in words. Prudence taught them plain. The way she did everything, no wasted motion, no unkind correction. Every woman's particular shape treated as a fact to design around rather than a flaw to apologize for. Word of it traveled the way word travels through mountain country, slow but thorough, until women rode out 2 days from settlements Prudence had never heard of, just to sit at that second table and learn from the woman folks had started calling, with a respect that had nothing grudging left in it at all, the finest hands this side of the fort. She wrote Charlotte that first winter, a long letter, full of everything, the mountain, the wedding. The second table Zeke had built, without being asked, and Charlotte's answer, when it finally came in spring, made her laugh out loud, alone in the kitchen, because tucked in among the news of Ashford's shop was a single line that read, "Mrs. Halloway came in last month, wanting a gown taken out. I told her our best hands had gone west to marry a mountain man who thought her more than fine just as she was. She did not ask for a second fitting." Prudence kept that letter in the tin box with the 6 from Zeke. Because it belonged there, she decided proof that the honest room her mother had promised her existed. Somewhere hadn't been a comfort invented to ease a hard childhood, after all. It had simply been 400 miles further west than either of them had ever thought to look. Some evenings, work done, the two of them sat together on the ridge above the post, near the 2 lodgepole pines, where a second cross now stood beside the first small plane, marking not a grave but simply the date, carved into cedar, the way Zeke carved everything that mattered to him. The day a fire hadn't taken what a company letter said it had. "Do you ever wonder," Prudence asked him once, watching the light go gold, then rust, then blue, exactly as promised, "what would have happened if Crane's rider had been 30 seconds faster? If I'd reached the fort 30 seconds later?" "No," Zeke said, and meant it, the plain way he meant everything. A man can spend his whole life wondering about the 30 seconds that didn't happen. "I'd rather spend mine grateful for the ones that did." She smiled at that, the easy, unhurried thing he'd come to know as her truest expression, the one that had nothing left in it of a shop doorway in Philadelphia, or a woman's cruel appraisal, or 16 years of being praised for her hands and quietly diminished for everything else. Below them, the trading post sat solid in the last of the light, smoke rising steady from its chimney, a plain blue curtain glowing faint gold in the one window that caught the sun longest, and somewhere inside, on the second table Zeke had built without being asked, 6 pairs of shears lay waiting for morning, and 6 women's worth of hope, plainly and honestly earned, the same way Prudence Wynne had earned every good thing that had ever finally, rightfully, found its way to her. She thought sometimes in the quiet moments a full life still left room for, of the notice she'd nearly walked past in the back pages of a Philadelphia newspaper, one column, among dozens, no flattering adjectives, nothing dressed up to catch a desperate eye. She'd almost not read it at all, almost let the humiliation of that one Tuesday afternoon convince her the only honest room left in the world was the one she already knew, however small, however little it had ever asked of her beyond endurance. She was glad. Every single evening she sat on that ridge with the light, doing exactly what a mountain man's plain, unpracticed sentence had once promised her it would, that she'd read 4 lines further down the page, instead of folding the paper closed. Some rooms, she'd come to understand, a person has to travel a very great distance to find. And some, it turned out, had been waiting all along at the bottom of a column. Nobody else had thought worth reading past the first few flattering lies.